Welcome, everybody, to Reimagining the Internet. We've got a conversation today with Trebor Scholz. Trebor is a scholar activist. He is a professor at the New School in New York City. He's the founding director of the Platform Co-op Consortium and the Research Institute for the Cooperative Digital Economy at the New School. He has what must be one of the most busy years off ever, where he is a fellow at the Open Society Foundation, at the Harvard Berkman Klein Center, and the Berggruen Institute. And the reason we're talking with Trebor is that he's someone who has coined the idea of platform cooperativism. He's been talking about this very important and very helpful idea since 2014. And I think it's one of the ideas that we're really going to want to wrestle with as we think about these questions of the future of the internet. Trebor, it's so good to have you here.
Yeah, it's really nice to reconnect. Thank you for having me. Really glad to be here.
So we have a format that some people fight and that some people embrace, and we're happy either way. But I almost always start these conversations by asking my guest, what's wrong with the internet, and what would you like to do to correct it?
Well, I think I would probably start by framing the question a bit more broadly, focusing on platform capitalism at large. So emphasizing that we really can't just look at the internet in isolation. And so a bit of background. So my activism, research, and intellectual community building has focused on the way people work online for a long time, longer than I care to remember. So in 2014, I suggested bringing the worker co-op model to the digital economy, asking what it would be like if you had an Uber that would be owned by its drivers, or an Airbnb that would be owned by its residents, and that had an enormous resonance, and two books followed, and many conferences at the New School. Now we have a research institute that focuses on the cooperative digital economy. Just welcomed 7 new PhD students that focus on that. And several political parties have made that platform cooperativism part of their political platform, like the Social Democrats in Germany, the Labour Party in the UK under the previous and current leadership, and also the Legislative Assembly in Kerala in India. So we have some 500 projects in 47 countries right now, ranging in sectors from domestic care to home delivery, agriculture, also some work in short-term rentals and e-hailing, and also social media. Right? So I think it's a split screen between digital labor practices and also cooperative internet infrastructure. And I think, Ethan, I think this is just while this has, we just talked about this a minute ago, has not been an easy year, but this is really a truly cooperative moment. On the one hand, there's this atmosphere of emergency that's used to push a politics of austerity. And then there's this sort of rhetoric of a return to normalcy, propagated by establishment politicians, as a sort of simple way of trying to control this moment and appease everybody who wants to imagine and build a different future. But then I think, historically, when you look at exactly moments like that, when, safety nets that were provided by governments or communities or families fall apart, right? This is exactly the moment historically when co-ops emerged, right? And so it's not so surprising that we had a real increase in interest in this work over the last year. Yeah.
So let's back up a little bit and talk about sort of two different kinds of platform cooperatives. So when we use this term platform, we can mean fairly different things, right? So there's one branch of the internet in which what we're often talking about are, or what economists sometimes call two-sided markets. You have providers of services, you have consumers of services, you try to match them up. Airbnb, Uber, those both might fall into that space, and the platforms view themselves as quote unquote neutral providers matching buyers and sellers. And you and I think, would both agree that they are far from neutral. There's also platforms in the sense that we tend to talk about social media platforms, which is they are service providers that are allowing people to share information online, connect with each other in different ways, and they are being matched involuntarily with advertisers who want their attention in order to sort of pay for those things. Let's take the two in turn. How do platform cooperatives alter both of those models? What does platform cooperativism look like in building an alternative to an Uber or an Airbnb?
Think it's not the right framing. Sorry, because so often at these at events or in conversations, I guess that's sort of just a natural place to go, right? Is to say like, so can this be, or how is this an alternative to Uber, Google, Apple, Amazon, right? But what we find actually, and also historically, when you look at the history of cooperatives, that's not really what co-ops have done, right? They haven't really replaced large corporations. And when you look at something like smart.coop, right, it's a platform co-op that has offers an employment status to freelancers, thereby affording them unemployment insurance, health insurance, etc. You see, I don't want to go too far into it, but just to show that this is something very specific to the co-op structure that has really hardly anything to do with these big tech companies, and yet it's present in 9 European countries, has 35,000 members, and is quite important, right? So I think that, or if you look at Italian community cooperatives, I think they might be the best way to think about what can happen on the internet. Think of an Italian village in the mountains, right? So hundreds of years old, and people are leaving, and so now people have to think about how they get their sick to the hospital, how they run the postal service, how they run the restaurant so that tourists still come in the hotel. And so they're forming community cooperatives to do all these things at once, right?
Okay.
So, and I'm just like extremely fascinated and inspired by this, which is not directly talking about platform co-ops, but it is, I think, a really, it serves the needs that are just, underserved by, the government or by communities or individuals. So this is what I sort of often, with many of these platform cooperatives, they find like very particular areas in which they serve the needs of people, in care, in home care, in home delivery services. For example, in also Italy. Italy is on my mind today, I guess. The city of Bologna just launched a platform co-op. And the way they went about it is very different than what we are used to from Deliveroo or Uber Eats or places like that, where they surveyed 150 people in the community in the midst of the pandemic, asking them what they need, right? Okay. From the store owner to the libraries, from the bread factory to the unions to the cooperatives. And they found that, yes, they needed delivery services, right? So what came out was a home delivery service, but thought about and framed in a way very differently to anything else we've seen in the United States, which is they bring books to people's houses from the library. They thought about staying with elder, with pensioners and talking to them because they are so socially isolated, right? They pick up food, they deliver bread in the morning to the restaurants, and serve, also deliver pizza. But it is it's much more just it came out of the needs of the whole ecosystem, not just the workers. I thought that was really interesting.
So the point being that platform cooperatives are not just Uber Eats that happen to be owned by the participants within the system. Platform cooperatives are a different way of going about solving a set of social problems. Is that right?
Yeah, and when you think of sort of Hal Nissenbaum's idea of value-sensitive design, right? So it really responds also in the design of the platforms uniquely to the challenges, right? Think of Up and Go Cooperative in New York City, which has realized that worker profiles are really just there to pit workers against one another. And I found this extremely unuseful. So they just got rid of that when they designed the app and said basically no worker profiles for us. When I talked to women, when we were starting a platform co-op in Ahmedabad in Gujarat with the Seva Federation, we spoke to the women and I asked them what kind of ideas they would have for an app. And these are women who did have not much idea of this world at all. They knew WhatsApp and a little bit of Facebook. The first thing was an arm went up and said like no worker profiles, right? Okay. So you see how they are not just copying these companies. They're really quite can be very unique. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about how platform cooperatives are working in terms of social media or digital spaces?
Yeah, absolutely. So there basically is a movement, right, to create decentralized peer-to-peer services. There's a lot of experimentation with cooperative data ownership. There are projects like My Data in Switzerland, which created cooperative patient data ownership, which is then where the patient has the opportunity to release the data to their doctor for free, but perhaps to a for-profit research institute at a pay, right, at a fee, which is then donated to public research. So it's not that anybody makes money from that. There's experimentation with data trusts, right? So I wrote a research paper for Sidewalk Labs together with Jutta Treviranus from the Inclusive Research Design Center in Toronto, where we proposed a cooperative data trust for the Sidewalk Labs project, which would essentially allow the people, the residents of this area, to govern the data that are collected on them and to decide in the first place, much along the lines of the work we saw in Barcelona around data sovereignty, right? To really that people can also decide which data are actually collected in the first place.
So this question of data trusts and data unions gets into interesting waters very quickly, because there's some group of people essentially warning that allowing the collection of data and the possibility of its resale, you offered a very innocuous example, which is to use aggregated data for medical research. Once we get into things like, tracking data, data that's used for ad targeting and things like that, there's at the same time people arguing for decentralized platforms precisely to sort of get rid of that data. This, for me, raises this really interesting question. Is data something that we should be valuing and trying to figure out how to get compensated for our collective data? Or is it something that we should be sort of protecting from exposure? Should we be turning it into an asset, or should we be simply trying to stop the idea of it being commoditized in that way?
Well, one thing I think where there's a unique opportunity for cooperatives, sort of giving a maybe roundabout answer to your question, is that the cooperative community is organized around the 7 cooperative principles. One of is that cooperatives benefit other cooperatives and work with to the benefit of other cooperatives. So you have that essentially enshrined in this work, which really opens the gates to shared data standards and data commons, right, where cooperatives worldwide could share their data. And I think this is also maybe an answer that's really more urgent to a lot of people in this movement, is like, how can you actually scale this, right? And one way to scale it is we found over the last few years that most of these cooperatives work best when they stay local and are relatively small, but then federate, right, and have a shared digital infrastructure. So you see this, for example, with Coop Cycle in France, which has established a software for delivery cooperatives in Europe. So they work with 47 cooperatives. They're all quite small, and they have open source software that these cooperatives can use, right? And so in that sense, then the data could be shared and bring the benefit, right, to this, and also create an entity that could actually compete in the market, right, through federation, right, by creating networks. You see this similarly in India, right, where the Seva Federation has this large number, I think it's 115 cooperatives in its federation, while also being a union at the same time with 1.4 million people, right, working together to benefit as an ecosystem, right, the self-employed poor women in India, right? So you see how this sort of the opportunities for like data commons are like kind of obvious there, right? Like to share data to the benefit of all members.
There's two ideas there that we end up sort of talking a lot on this show and in some of the discussions that we've been having. The first one is the notion of small and federated, because this is very much what people are now sort of proposing for alternative social media spaces. It's very, very difficult to imagine social media spaces where we all create our own incompatible software. It's much more likely that we're going to have some basic standards, some open source packages, and the ability to federate between those systems at minimum around things like identity, the ability to sort of move in and out of each other's spaces. The other one that seems critical is that when you have sufficiently small spaces, it's probably easier for the communities to be involved with actually managing them. And this, to me, seems like one of the critical failures in these very large scale platforms, whether the transactional platforms like Uber or the social media platforms like Facebook, is that the people who are using these systems have essentially no voice and authority on how they're carried out. When we get systems that are much smaller, the problem of governance becomes more tractable, which not only has a chance of those platforms being fairer, but also has all sorts of positive externalities, like people sort of participating within governance. What are lessons learned from platform cooperativism about how groups learn how to govern themselves?
That's the central, amazing question. Yeah. The larger these cooperatives get, the harder it is to really offer democratic governance, right? Like a lived democratic governance, and also a feeling of these members actually to be really part of this organization. And well, how do they solve it? How do people start to solve these issues? Is with tools like Lumio, right, from Inspiral in New Zealand, and through, participatory processes to really try to engage and also, frankly, tell people about the co-op model, right? So there are many large platforms where people just realize, like, well, this platform just pays much better than the others. So that's why they are there, right? And then they are learning that governance might also be part of the picture, and that this is actually a cooperative. Example I mentioned earlier, Smart.coop in Europe, and then also in Canada, Stocksy United is a platform for stock photography and video, and it has around 1,000 photographers. It's incredibly competitive, and made, I think they had a revenue of like $13 million last year. So it's quite successful in many ways. But they also found they paid twice as much as, or more than twice as much. It's the highest paid service, I think, actually in that industry for your images, right? For stock photography. But, then to really operate this as a cooperative is not easy. So on the back end, they have an educational portal, which is really interesting because sort of triggering out these or teasing out these differences, right? Education is another one, right? That's also specific to cooperatives, that they educate their members, right? Getty Images couldn't care less, right? If they
Right, they probably don't want you to understand the financial model behind it, whereas cooperatives absolutely require you to understand how it works. Yes.
But when you commit to a limited number of artists, right? Like let's say even like 1,000, then that's actually in your interest, right? To actually educate them and make them produce better products actually for the cooperative, as a producer cooperative that it is.
So for someone who's listening to this and saying, I really want to learn more about this. I want more platform cooperatives in my life. Are there platform cooperatives that people can join, other than the sort of highly geographic, highly local ones that we've been largely talking about? Are there, people often sort of come out of a discussion like this and sort of say, I want to try a decentralized social network, and then sign up for Mastodon. Is there sort of a parallel in the in the platform co-op space?
First of all, there is platform.coop where people can go, which is a hub for people to learn about this work. We have, like our mailing list and newsletter and all of that. But earlier this year, we partnered with Mondragon University and the Platform Co-op Consortium. And now we started offering an online course together on platform co-ops. And like in the summer, 1,000 people asked to be registered from over 40 countries. And this is now still running, so now in the second edition. And it's a wonderful way of getting an introduction to this topic. And then in the second half of the course, actually incubate your own idea in collaboration with local partners. So we have over 40 local organizations around the world that incubate with participants in their local language. And actually in our next edition that will start probably in June, offered through the New School, we will also offer it, well, in Spanish again and in English, but then also in Portuguese. And in the first edition, we also had a Korean track, and then all the lectures were translated in all these languages. So it's really, it's a good way to start, because the most amazing thing about it is that the people get to know each other, right? So here you have an ecosystem of people that all get to know each other's projects, can now collaborate on their, businesses and learn from each other.
Is there a future where we have strong alternatives in front of us, where we can sort of ask the question, do I want an Uber or a Lyft, or do I want to go with a ride sharing cooperative that's actually a cooperative? Is the goal here to complement some of these exploitive business models? Is it to run them out of town? Think big for me for a bit here. What are your ambitions for this movement?
Well, that's actually that we're thinking about quite concretely now. Definitely to create a very large number of jobs in the next 10 years, which I think is something that is obviously particularly needed right now. Also in the global south, right? We're also thinking about conversions. So what would it be like to convert something like care.com into a cooperative, right? Mm-hmm. In fact, right now, my colleague Nathan Schneider is converting, sort of nonprofits into cooperatives, which is also an important area there. It's essentially to scale it with Mondragon. I think to really reach into the cooperative movement worldwide, and continue these experiments, create incubators, reaching. I mean, we're already reaching tens of thousands of people, but to go beyond that and really create jobs that are probably, in my opinion, not predominantly competing with these large, big companies. We saw projects like that not do incredibly well, but in New York City, we actually have one underway, which looks incredibly promising. It's the Drivers Cooperative, which aims to be a tertiary service in this area. But then, Ethan, this is also doesn't just apply to these particular areas. We are also thinking about higher education, right?
Sure.
We are thinking about what can you do with the some 60 million artisans in India. Could you create a cooperative marketplace for them, right? What could you do with the 650,000 people returning from prison in the United States every year?
Right, who have incredibly difficult problems with re-entering the workforce, and campaigns like Ban the Box and others have not necessarily gone and affirmatively created workplaces that are welcoming re-entry from incarceration.
Right. And then, going back to I think one of your earlier episodes that I listened to, also cooperative music streaming, right?
Yeah.
I, spoke with Resonate, the CEO of Resonate, just a few days ago, and I think one of the big contributions, and I think this is what is so important to get across, right, is I remember this conversation. I was at a business conference in Madrid and in this very fancy hotel. And in the breakout session, I was talking with an economist who writes for the New York Times and shall remain unnamed. And I asked him about this, so what do you think of cooperatives? And he literally looked at me and said, like, insignificant part of the GDP, and turned around and walked off. And so, and maybe, like, sure, right? Like when you look at the data, Finland, the Netherlands, have like around 10% of the GDP, but those numbers can be contested, might be more like 3 or 4% even there. But I think what's really important to understand, what is actually the value proposition of these projects, And I think that's part for this sort of big vision, like what are they actually contributing, right? They contribute something very different. When I talked to the Resonate founder just a few days ago, right, he described to me how it's a relatively small, cooperative, some 2,000 members, but it really creates a culture. It contributes a culture of music, right, for fans and musicians, a sort of social network in which they are connected, which is a very different value proposition that's hard to quantify, right? When I talk to the recent immigrant who works for Up and Go, she describes how the dignity that she receives, from working for this cooperative, the dignity that changes the way she feels in her everyday life, and also how her husband is looking at her. This is how one worker described it. So that's, I think, something that's really hard to put a value on,
Is it possible that the real contribution of platform cooperativism is embedding a different set of values into the design of these different forms of platforms going forward?
Well, that's definitely already happening, right? For sure. I think there's also another potential, which is really the fact that this is not just about economic activity, but also about the possibility of connecting distributed workers. In the sense that if you go back to the 1880s, right, like where there was, with the Knights of Labor, there's historically, of course, this deep connection between cooperatives and unions, right? Also they emerged in the same place, almost at the same time, north of England, like 1844 in Rochdale. So you had guilds forming into unions, and you had these sort of first cooperative, well, not the first, but the most recognizable cooperatives emerge. So lots of parallels there as well. So they can also increase the associational power of workers, right? Freelancers, let's say, that are distributed, and which unions have very insufficiently addressed or protected, right?
I'm curious. We've been trying to sort of define a set of almost what we're calling like a civic logic for sort of thinking about if you were to redesign something like a social network with principles that, this is a network designed for strengthening ties between people, that it's designed to make people more powerful as citizens and as neighbors and more accountable to one another, that these networks have to be involved with their own governance. They can't sort of outsource it to third parties. Is there a set of logics that you can imagine as a set of cooperative values that could sort of inform technical design, even of platforms that are not setting up co-ops? Are there lessons to be learned from platform co-ops around the value sphere, or is it really a parallel economic model?
Well, I think I mean, first of all, it's about ownership, right? I mean, you can't fully control what you don't own. And I think that's a lesson, right? Like, I think there's a real competitive advantage of platform co-ops to other businesses where they can say, well, to users and workers that, we can actually control your privacy to a much fuller extent because we own the platform. But then it's also about inclusive design and co-design, right? So that these projects, that the people you want to end up with, right, are really part of this project from day one, and that the project responds to the needs and all along responds to the needs of the people you are designing it with and for, right?
So, Trevor, one of the things that I'm really fascinated with the co-op movement in general and platform cooperativism in particular is that it's clearly an alternative to traditional corporate models, but it also seems like an alternative to government-supported services. You can imagine, for instance, those delivery services being set up during times of COVID, something that could be set up and administered either by a federal government or a local government. Is there a danger that in sort of solving our problems through co-ops, that we are sort of letting the government off the hook yet again, and sort of accepting a level of government failure that we then have to make up for as individual citizens? Shouldn't we demand some of these services as public services?
Well, Ethan, I think everything at once, right? We should demand them, and we should also help the people who, for the past, not help the people, but supporting people who help themselves already. That over the past 50 years, the failed politics of the past 50 years, right, that has not sufficiently addressed economic inequality with the American worker, like since 1972, 1978, in that range, right? Like hasn't their wages, if adjusted for inflation, haven't really increased, while their productivity has vastly increased. Who is watching out for them? Who is watching out for them? I spoke yesterday with an infectious disease nurse from Seattle, who, in the most emotional terms ever, right, complained to me and basically says, she doesn't know where to turn because the United States healthcare system is so broken, right? I mean, she likened it to a genocide. And therefore turned to my course on platform cooperatives because she said, well, what else should we do, right? I mean, we need to help ourselves, right? It's a similar move you saw with the Zapatistas, right? It's a similar move that you see all over the world. I mean, this is how, even in the United States, rural electric cooperatives, right, which have now 40 million members in the United States, that association, that cover, I think, 41% of the American grid is cooperatively owned. So there's a reason for that, right? So because of the vast failure of the system. And so, but this should not prevent us from, pushing for participatory democracy as much of an ideal and however unrealized that may have ever been, right? I mean, give me an example, right, of where that ever worked.
I think that notion of a response to failure is perhaps maybe the best argument here. That in many cases we have problems that have not adequately been solved by the markets. We have problems that have not adequately been solved by the public sector. Cooperatives at that point offer another vision for going ahead and doing this. There's a lot of really interesting thinking here, and it's wonderful to have the resource of your course to turn to. Trevor, this has really been a pleasure. It's so great to catch up with you and your work, and I really appreciate you coming and talking about the cooperative movement and the implications it might have for the future of the internet. Thanks for being with us.